Now, one of the things that you need to sort of think about with the Education Act that we've got to look at, um, was it any good? That's the key question here, isn't it? Was this thing that the Labour government introduced actually any good, and did it improve things for the population? There are two ways of looking at this with the Education Act. Much of these things that we look at aren't there? Two things that we look at, two sides of the argument, and very much the case with this one. Now, the on the one hand, and this is quite a biggie, I think, is that you've got this idea that suddenly the Education Act means that the education isn't just for rich people. Okay, so what that meant is that suddenly there's a system that's in place where the standard of education you receive isn't entirely based on money. Okay, remember before the war, no matter how clever you were, okay, you weren't, if you were from a poor family, you weren't ever going to get a top job. Suddenly you've got a system where even if you're from a poor family, if your kids are clever enough, they can go to a grammar school and they can likely make a better life for themselves. So that's one thing. The other thing is that education becomes free across the board. Okay, so previously there were all these schools that used to charge fees. Now the Education Act kind of stops this, because what it means is that if a school wants to claim some funds from the government for educating children, then they're not allowed to charge fees. So another big thing the Education Act does is it abolishes fees pretty much across the board, unless you're like the super rich that send their kids to private schools like Eton or whatever. Now that's a really good thing, because it means that poorer people from poorer backgrounds suddenly have access to the better schools that they never would have done before. So, in many ways, we can see it's a success, because if you're clever enough, you've got access to a good education. And that's a good thing. You suddenly can change your life. However, a couple of issues. If you go to a technical or secondary modern school, because either you've passed the 11 plus at a lower level or you failed it, the options you have in your life are greatly reduced. Now, a lot of people would argue that, well, look, you're sitting at a test here at the age of 11, which is a very, very young age, that determines what things you can do for the rest of your life. Now, what about if you're someone who's a bit of a late bloomer? What if you've had a bit of a bad start in life and that maybe you're not quite there at the age of 11? What if I'm sure some of you, progress significantly in secondary school, or you might even get to 18, 19 and then progress from there. So having something that, the Labour government introduced it, and it was well intended, but actually all this does is it means that if you go to a secondary modern school, which is the worst schools, you get a worse standard of education, so you've got worse teachers, get less funding, so the things like standards within your schools, the equipment, everything else is worse. And your ability to go to university or access good education later on is minimal. You're simply expected to leave school at 15 and that's it. So they don't, in a way, you go to a secondary modern school and you're kind of forgotten about, other than the fact that you might go and, be an apprentice somewhere, you might go and work in a shop, or you might go and be a plumber or a builder or all of those things. Doesn't give you a lot of opportunity. So this is the one big criticism, is that actually education is still unequal, because all it means is that it's determined on a test at 11 rather than just wealth. So, your sort of thoughts on that really, worth you thinking about. Do you think this is a really good thing that suddenly actually poor kids can have a good education? Or actually are we still looking at a system that just discriminates still against the vast majority of people? So that's what you need to consider.